Tuco tasted something he'd never experienced before and was so excited that he started dancing and waving his arms.
Tight, yeah!
This was top-quality stuff that Tuco had never seen back in his hometown in Mexico. After that, he promptly paid the money and decided to work with Heisenberg for the long term. However, Nodo's loose lips accidentally angered Tuco, which cost Nodo's dearly and made Walter and Jesse even more fearful of Tuco. This is the beginning of the second season of Breaking Bad. Continuing the plot from the end of the first season, Walter and Jesse return to their car, terrified. After some precise mental calculations by Walter, he figured out that he needed to leave $737,000 in cash for his family before he died. Based on the money he got from each deal, he would have to trade with Tuco at least 11 more times to reach his goal. Learning from this lesson, Walter decided that all future deals should take place in busy public areas so that Tuco wouldn't be able to fly into a rage unchecked. Jesse looked at Walter with a face full of horror. Clearly, he was not willing to take such risks to make money, but he didn't know how to refuse Walter and could only drive properly for now. However, just as they were about to leave, they found that Tuco's car had turned back. It turned out that Nodos was so badly injured that he was about to die, and Tuco wanted the clever Walter to help save him. Although Walter was talented in chemistry, he was not omnipotent. At this point, Nodos had already lost his pulse, and Walter could do nothing. Seeing Nodos unable to take a beating, an angry Tuco went up and kicked him several more times, scaring Walter and Jesse into retreating. They knew Tuco was ruthless, but they didn't expect him to be so merciless that he wouldn't even spare a dead man. He ordered his henchman Gonzo to dispose of the body. Although Gonzo was reluctant, he still didn't dare to defy Tuco's orders. As Gonzo was stuffing the body under the car, he accidentally touched the chassis. The stacked cars above made a creaking, shaking noise, frightening him so much that he quickly stood up and backed away. This set the stage for his subsequent death. Seeing Tuco slowly regain his calm, Walter and Jesse prepared to sneak away. As they were leaving, Jesse was pushed to the ground by Tuco, but Jesse dared not speak out in anger. They hurriedly drove away. Back at home, Walter, in a daze, kept changing TV channels, not even hearing his wife calling him.
Are you okay?
Right?
Worried that Walter was hungry, his thoughtful wife went to get him something to eat. At this moment, Walter, with tears in his eyes and a troubled face, came to his wife's side. He had planned to relax with his wife, but was chastised by his unprepared wife. At this moment, Walter didn't know what to do and could only sit by the pool to ease his panicked mood. Skylar thinks he's worried because of the cancer, which she understands, but warns Walter that he can't take it out on himself again. Meanwhile, Jesse bought a gun secretly for self-defense. The next day, Walter found Jesse, and the two of them had a heated argument. Panicked, Jesse hadn't slept all night. Seeing a car moving back and forth in front of his house, he was certain Tuco was ready to take them out, but Walter didn't think so and advised Jesse not to be paranoid because he still wanted to make his small fortune through Tuco. Seeing Walter's attitude, Jesse became anxious. He insisted they find a way to take out Tuco, or else they would be the ones to die. Then Jesse pulled out a gun he had prepared. Walter asked Jesse what his exact plan was. Jesse suggested that Walter create a new product. During the trade, Tuco would definitely taste it first, and they could take the opportunity to kill him right then. But the attentive Walter immediately spotted a flaw in Jesse's plan. Saying Tuco wouldn't come alone, Walter asked Jesse how many bullets the gun could hold. Jesse tried to check but couldn't open the magazine. Walter mocked him, saying he couldn't even open a magazine and still wanted to go kill someone.
It's not that easy, is it?
Hey man, well you did it.
On the other hand, Marie, discovered by Skylar to be stealing, refused to admit her wrongdoing. Skylar was so angry that she ignored her sister until she apologized and admitted her mistakes. However, Marie kept acting as if nothing was wrong, asking her sister out to have fun, but her sister never picked up her phone. There's a detail here. The cup Marie used had "We See Right 3" written on it, which is an ironic comment on Marie's thievery. Everyone knows what she's thinking, but only she herself is playing dumb. Hank also noticed her friction with Skylar, but Marie still refused to admit it. When leaving, Hank didn't forget to remind Marie to see a psychologist, as he had long known about Marie's issues and had been secretly treating her. Although Marie verbally agreed, she was very resistant inside, as could be seen when she deliberately crushed a neighbor kid's toy car. Although Hank was speechless, this was also related to his indulgence of his wife. Helplessly, he had to foot the bill for Marie's behavior. Just arriving at the DEA, Hank received a surveillance video of raw materials being stolen from a chemical plant in the south of the city. Watching the clumsy thieves, Hank and his colleagues couldn't help but laugh. Learning that a barrel of methylamine was stolen, Hank immediately realized this was the old-school academic way of doing things in the arts, and they also knew how to use thermite to unlock doors. It had to be said that these two thieves were quite knowledgeable about chemistry. Stephen guessed it might just be two students messing around, but Hank prayed that he would be the one to catch them. It would be even worse if those Mexicans set their sights on them. When Walter returned home that night, he found an SUV loitering at his doorstep, which kept him up all night. He was worried that Tuco was coming to harm his family. Just then, the phone suddenly rang. It was another message from Marie. Skylar heard it and immediately hung up. Skylar questioned Walter why he wasn't sleeping in bed. Walter quickly explained that he felt unwell and couldn't sleep. It must be said that Walter's lying skills had now become quite polished. Only after his wife left did he put the knife he was holding back. Then Walter rushed over to Jesse's place. Last time, Jesse had revealed his background to Crazy 8. Walter thought Jesse had leaked the information this time too, but Jesse firmly denied it, knowing that with Tuco's capabilities, finding Walter's house wouldn't be difficult. This made Walter's heart chill. His initial intention in starting this path was to protect his family, and he couldn't let his family be threatened because of Tuco. At that moment, Jesse suggested Walter buy another gun to increase their odds of winning, but Walter said he had a better idea. He pulled out a small packet of castor beans from his pocket. This left the clueless Jesse completely baffled. Walter had to patiently explain that he could extract ricin from them, a deadly poison that could kill someone in very small doses, undetectably. Meanwhile, at home alone and bored, Skylar looks at old photos to relieve her boredom, and inadvertently sees an intimate photo of herself and her former boss, which sets the stage for her to return to the company. Just then, Hank suddenly visited because he knew Skylar had been ignoring Marie's calls, making Marie cold towards him too. He wanted Skylar to reconcile with Marie for his sake. Reluctantly, Skylar told Hank about Marie's stealing, but Hank remained very calm. At this moment, Skylar realized that Hank had always known about Marie's issues. Hank explained he had been trying hard to persuade Marie to see a psychologist, but it was a gradual process. He hoped Skylar could understand Marie and help her. However, this speech directly angered Skylar.
Me, the almost 40-year-old pregnant woman with a surprise baby on the way, and the husband with lung cancer who disappears for hours on end and I don't know where he goes and he barely even speaks to me anymore, with the moody son who does the same thing, and the overdrawn checking account, and the lukewarm water heater that leaks rusty-looking and is rotting out the floor of the utility closet and we can't even afford to fix it. But oh, I see. Now I'm supposed to go, Hank. Please, what can I possibly do to further benefit my spoiled, kleptomaniac sister, who somehow always manages to be the center of attention? Because God knows, she's the one with the really important problems.
Hank was completely taken aback, seeing Skylar break down crying, and he carefully approached to comfort her. On the other side, after a long and complex process, Walter finally successfully extracted the ricin. They then continuously rehearsed the poisoning scenario, inventing various lines to ensure nothing went wrong. This was the typical nervous mentality of ordinary people before committing a crime. Just then, Walter received a call from Hank, who was on duty. He said he had accidentally angered Skylar during the day. He had wanted to resolve the conflict between the sisters but ended up making things worse. He wanted to get a sense of Skylar's condition through Walter, not expecting Walter to still be out so late. Hank, who likes to show off, sends Walter a photo of the crime scene to open his eyes. To their surprise, the scene showed no does. The henchman Tuco had beaten to death. Oddly enough, Gonzo was also found dead at the scene. Seeing this, Walter froze. He quickly got dressed, took Jesse's only gun, and told Jesse to get as far away as possible. They believed that since Tuco had killed Gonzo, they would be next. Walter hurried back to protect his family. Jesse quickly took the money he had hidden, ready to run away. Panicked, Walter returned home and called out his wife and child's names, but no one responded, and the house was eerily quiet. Hearing a slight noise from the bathroom, Walter cautiously approached with his gun. Opening the door, he found his wife safe in the bath and learned his son was staying overnight at a friend's house. Walter finally breathed a sigh of relief. He hurriedly took the money he had hidden in the air vent and put it in his daughter's diaper box, including Jesse's gun. He was afraid that if something happened to him, his family wouldn't be able to find the money he had hidden. Meanwhile, Hank, after careful identification, discovered that the two dead were Tuco's men, likely killed because they were no longer of use. However, turning Gonzo's body over revealed that he had died from massive blood loss due to an accident while moving the body when something fell and crushed his arm. Early on, when Tuco told Gonzo to dispose of the body, Gonzo had said they couldn't just leave Nodos here. So Gonzo, behind Tuco's back, came here intending to properly bury Nodos but ended up losing his life. Meanwhile, Skylar noticed Walter was very troubled and tried to communicate with him, but Walter said he didn't know where to start. Just then, Jesse called, but Walter hung up directly. Then he saw a shadow pass by the window. Panicked, Walter rushed to the window to check but found Jesse's car already parked at the door. Confused, Walter hurried out to send him away, only to find Tuco in the back seat pointing a gun at Jesse.
Get in.
Shocked, Walter had no choice but to leave without saying goodbye. He is the most brutal man in Breaking Bad. Simply because a subordinate spoke out of turn and stole his thunder, he beat him to death. Then he had his brother-in-law Gonzo hastily dispose of the body. However, Gonzo couldn't bear Nodo's tragic death and secretly prepared to give Nodos a proper burial behind Tuco's back. Yet, while moving the body, he unexpectedly got his arm crushed by a car and bled to death. Later, the DEA discovered both bodies, and the experienced Hank identified them as Tuco's men and decided to raid Tuco's hideout. But the cunning Tuco noticed Gonzo's disappearance and sensed trouble, so he kidnapped Jesse and Walter and fled in the middle of the night. Sure enough, early the next morning, Hank led his team to storm Tuco's hideout and arrested all his men, but Tuco was nowhere to be found. Fortunately, they found Tuco's fingerprints at the scene. Back at the office, Hank cheered on his colleagues, encouraging them to work hard to find any leads on Tuco. However, after the meeting, Hank confided to Steven that he guessed Tuco had already fled back to Mexico. It must be said that Hank has a real knack for investigating cases, but he completely overlooked Walter. Because of Walter's disappearance, Hank received a call from Skylar asking for help, and he decided to skip work to assist her, asking Steven to handle some of his work in the meantime. Although Hank often jokes with Steven, Steven always supports Hank when it matters. Hank hurried to Walter's house, where Skylar actively provided any information the police needed, detailing the events of the previous night. Among the details, Skylar mentioned that Walter's phone rang, but he looked at it and hung up immediately, which could be an important clue. Skylar also asked Hank to trace the incoming call, but Hank said he was already trying. However, after the investigation ended, Hank told the detectives that he had checked Walter's phone and there were no calls during that time. He suspected Walter had another phone, but to keep Walter's secret, Hank didn't say this outright in front of Skylar. The scene shifts and a phone with its battery removed falls from the sky. This phone is the work phone Jesse bought for Walter. Tuco had already taken Walter and Jesse to the Mexican border to prevent the police from tracking him, which is why he destroyed all the phones. Then Tuco dragged them out of the trunk and pushed them into a secluded cabin across the border. His uncle Hector, a former major contraband dealer in Mexico, was also there. Tuco ordered them to empty their pockets. Walter took this opportunity to place the rice and lace contraband on the table, praying that Tuco would taste it soon. It wasn't until he saw Walter's wallet that Tuco realized Heisenberg was just an alias and found photos of Walter's family. Tuco said he liked working with such people because it gave him more leverage, showing that Walter really cares about his family. When Tuco got Jesse's wallet, all he found was a condom. Tuco couldn't help but laugh at this, which showed that Jesse is a cynical street hustler. Then Tuco came up to Walter and gave him another hard time. Tuco said his hideout had been raided. All his men were arrested, but his brother-in-law Gonzo was unaccounted for, and he suspected Gonzo had informed the police. Thinking of how he treated Gonzo like a brother, Tuco couldn't accept this betrayal and vowed to find Gonzo and tear him apart. Little did he know, Gonzo was already dead. It was only then that Walter realized Gonzo's death wasn't Tuco's doing and expressed his sorrow, fearing that the police were looking for him. A nervous Tuco picked up the contraband on the table and prepared to use it, but he smelled it and sensed something was off and asked what it was. Jesse quickly explained that this stuff was even stronger than their last batch, but Tuco didn't taste it and instead shared his plan with Walter. He planned to take Walter to Mexico to work on contraband, where he'd be equipped with a super lab to work 24/7, but Walter said he couldn't bear to leave his family. Jesse chimed in but was stopped by Tuco, who apparently thought Jesse was useless. The clever Jesse quickly defended himself.
"'Cause I cooked that scante in your hands. Yeah. tell you something, yo. You've never tried nothing like it. It's a new product him and I've been working up. Careful when you hit it. It kicks like a 12 gauge when it comes on. It's got a secret ingredient.
What secret ingredient?
Chili powder.
Just as they were about to succeed, Tuco heard them say it was chili powder and immediately threw it away. They hadn't expected that chili powder was the thing Tuco hated the most.
We're gonna rewrite history with this.
Alright! Clean the manure out from between your ears! No, I need him, Tuco. I need him very, very badly. He's my partner. And if he doesn't go, I don't go.
I'll tell you this, my cousins are driving up here right now to smuggle us back down, and they're gonna be here by sunset, and you're gonna be on that truck, or you're gonna be dead! Better hope they got room in the trunk.
He then pulled up Walter's blue contraband and prepared to make history with it in Heisenberg. This was the first time Walter directly saved Jesse. In his heart, Jesse was like his own child, and he wouldn't allow anyone to hurt Jesse. This also showed the kind side of Walter's humanity. Meanwhile, the pregnant Skylar was also busy posting missing person flyers for Walter everywhere, and her sister Marie came over to help. Although they still had unresolved issues, they were relatively rational in the face of major events, and Skylar expressed her gratitude. Marie wanted to use this opportunity to continue explaining the tiara incident, but her attitude wasn't what Skylar hoped to see. So Skylar used an excuse to interrupt Marie. Clearly, Marie had no intention of repenting. Back at home, Walter Jr. was also busy continuously printing missing person flyers for Walter while the box where Walter kept his money was right next to him. But Walter Jr. never noticed it. When she got home, Marie urged her sister not to worry, suggesting that not finding Walter might be a good thing, as if Walter had committed suicide, he would probably have been found by others. Skylar said there must still be details they hadn't considered. However, Marie mentioned that Walter had 2 mobile phones, which made Hank tremble with anger. He had promised to keep Walter's secret. Skylar was bewildered. She didn't know what they were arguing about. Helplessly, Hank had to reveal the truth. This greatly shocked Skylar. She had lived with Walter for decades and had never seen him with 2 phones, which meant Walter definitely had his own little secrets, because Walter had previously admitted to buying contraband from his student Jesse. Marie suggested that Hank look for clues from Jesse. Unable to find Jesse, Hank followed the trail to Jesse's mother. After a bit of questioning, the old lady realized Hank was from the DEA and then immediately changed her attitude, stating she couldn't provide any help because she hadn't seen her son in over a month. As he was leaving, Hank confirmed Jesse's vehicle with her. Since Jesse didn't study well and spent a lot of time on his lowrider, the old lady was very angry about this. So Hank started with Jesse's car clue, which later helped him find Tuco. Meanwhile, Tuco, who was waiting for his cousins to arrive, decided to have a meal first while Walter and Jesse sat on the sofa whispering to each other. Because T.O., sitting across from them, was staring at them, the two of them blamed each other. Just then, the TV suddenly broadcast the news of the deaths of Tuco's 2 henchmen, frightening Walter into quickly changing the channel. Seeing no reaction from T.O. across the room, Walter went over to test him, and seeing him still motionless, Walter finally felt at ease. He worried that if Tuco found out Gonzo was dead, it would prove he wasn't a police informant, making them the only suspects. The two began to discuss how to take down Tuco. At that moment, Walter saw the unused rice-laced contraband on the table, so he decided to poison Tuco's food. Tuco, cooperating nicely, had made authentic Mexican chicken rolls and urged Walter and Jesse to eat quickly so they could hit the road. While Tuco wasn't paying attention, Walter quickly slipped the poison into Tuco's food. But this action was noticed by Hector. Just as Tuco was about to bite into a chicken roll, Hector rang his bell. Tuco thought Hector wanted to eat and said he'd feed him after he finished, then continued eating, but Hector rang the bell again, and Tuco looked at him impatiently. Hector's eyes were fixed on the chicken roll in Tuco's hand. Tuco thought Hector wanted his poor Hectorn and switched the plates, which dumbfounded Walter and Jesse. Hector made a huge effort to knock over the plate. Then his eyes locked onto Walter. Walter never expected to be outsmarted by a disabled old man. After the meal, Hector kept ringing the bell, looking at Walter and Jesse, and Tuco got a bit impatient. After several attempts, Tuco finally understood that Walter and Jesse had done something Hector disliked. Walter hurriedly explained that it might be because he changed the TV channel to something Hector didn't like, but Tuco checked with Hector and got a negative response. Seeing his uncle glaring menacingly at them, Tuco asked if these two were playing him, and Hector confirmed it with a bell ring. This made the brutal Tuco furious. He dragged Jesse out to execute him, with Walter following. Hector showed a look of triumph, because Walter was still Tuco's cash cow. The enraged Tuco opted to beat Jesse, demanding to know what they had done to him. Just then, Walter saw Jesse reach for a stone in the sand, so he confessed to poisoning Tuco to divert his attention. Hector.
We tried to poison you because you're an insane, degenerate piece of filth, and you deserve to die.
Jesse took the opportunity to smash the stone directly into Tuco's face, causing Tuco to fling the assault rifle away. Jesse desperately clung to Tuco while Walter went for the discarded weapon. In the chaos, Jesse reached for the gun behind Tuco's waist and shot him through the abdomen. This allowed Jesse to finally get his revenge. He kicked Tuco into the pit. A shocked Jesse couldn't bring himself to shoot. The two hurried to the car to escape, but the keys were still on Tuco. Just then, Jesse saw a car speeding toward them in the distance. Thinking it was Tuco's cousins, they panicked and ran, leaving the gun in the car. They hid behind a metal barrel to observe the situation. Hector. Tuco, in pain, crawled out of the pit. At that moment, the car arrived, and it was Hank. Hank had tracked Jesse's vehicle in form of Hector via satellite and followed it, expecting Jesse to be by the car, but instead, he found the wounded Tuco. Tuco saw the machine gun Walter had left in the car. He grabbed it while Hank wasn't looking and accidentally activated Jesse's lowrider mode. After a fierce gunfight, the bullets ran out quickly. The injured Tuco was too slow to reload. Hank quickly changed his magazine and aimed at Tuco, shooting him in the head as soon as he looked up. Hank slowly approached, which terrified Walter. He couldn't understand why Hank was there. To avoid being discovered by Hank, Walter quickly dragged Jesse away from the scene. When Hank reached Tuco, Jesse's lowrider also stopped bouncing, signaling that the struggling Tuco was dead. Meanwhile, in the room, Hector kept ringing the bell non-stop. If you saw someone streaking in the supermarket, you'd definitely think they were out of their mind. That's exactly the plan Walter designed, because Walter mysteriously disappeared for 3 days, and he couldn't let his family know about what happened during those days. Walter had no choice but to resort to this desperate measure. As Walter had hoped, he was sent to the psychiatric hospital, and the doctors notified his family to come and claim him. The moment he sees Skylar, Walter lets out an aggrieved look. How many points would you give Walter for this move? Because he's a cancer patient, under immense mental stress that led him to run away from home and then suffer intermittent amnesia. It's somewhat understandable, hearing his son mention that his uncle Hank had killed a major criminal. Walter, who was actually a witness, feigned shock. He kept asking about Hank's safety. This made his family not suspect Walter had anything to do with the incident. Skylar immediately informed Marie and told her about Walter appearing naked in the supermarket. Marie was utterly disgusted when she heard this, because Hank had killed Tuco and earned a commendation. His superior called him in for a talk. Hank found out that he went looking for his missing brother-in-law Walter, only to unexpectedly encounter the injured Tuco. Acting in self-defense, Hank decisively killed Tuco. Hank stated that Walter had been found and had nothing to do with the case. He went there entirely to look for Walter's former student Jesse, and although he found Jesse's car, he didn't see Jesse himself. The superior instructed Hank to thoroughly investigate Jesse, and Hank said he had already arranged for his men to look into it. The scene shifts to a police car parked outside Jesse's house, while Jesse is hiding in Badger's car, waiting for the right moment to act. Next is how Jesse will disassociate himself from Tuco. You can't help but admire Walter's intelligence after watching this, because all of this plan was discussed when Walter and Jesse were fleeing the border. Seeing that the police had left, Jesse and Badger immediately started to act. They now needed to clean up the scene in the basement. Badger was extremely excited by all these things, incessantly asking Jesse questions. Clearly, he didn't realize Jesse was in big trouble and was still thinking about getting Jesse to rush out a batch of contraband. Since they had worked together once before but fell out over disagreements, Badger asked Jesse to give him back that batch of contraband. This directly infuriated the already anxious Jesse.
Badger! Don't mess with me!
Seeing Jesse so agitated, Badger had no choice but to follow his plan. The two moved everything from the basement into the RV, including the barrel of methylamine they had stolen but hadn't used up. Then Jesse asked Badger to help get his cousin Clovis to tow the RV, but Clovis, knowing what he was hauling, immediately demanded a huge price, and he also refused to tow because Jesse didn't have enough money. This left Badger completely without face. But finally, after Badger's desperate pleading, they reached an agreement. Then Jesse told Badger to give him 2 hours before using a public phone to anonymously report him. The real show was about to begin. 2 hours later, Jesse had already arrived at Wendy's room in the motel, a well-known red light district in the town. At that moment, DEA agents, having received the anonymous tip, quickly arrived and precisely targeted the room, breaking in and arresting Jesse on the spot. But what Hank didn't know was that he had already fallen into the trap designed by Walter. He took Jesse to the DEA for questioning because they found his car at Tuco's place. Hank was convinced Jesse was definitely connected to Tuco, but Jesse denied everything, claiming he had been partying with Wendy these past few days and had even left his phone in the car. Hank reminded Jesse that his car had been found at the Mexican border. Jesse acted completely clueless, saying the car must have been stolen. He kept praising the DEA's efficiency for finding his car before he even noticed it was missing. Then Hank brought out over $60,000 found in the car and asked Jesse to claim it. Obviously, Jesse wouldn't admit that the money was his. Compared to the money, his own life was more important. Seeing that Jesse wouldn't confess, Hank had no choice but to go and question Wendy next door. But after all, Jesse was her long-term client, and they had already coordinated their stories in advance. Because Hank had once taken Walter Jr. to insult Wendy, she took the opportunity to accuse Hank, making him lose face in front of Steven. Steven said that without evidence, they could only release Jesse, but Hank still had his last trump card. With a familiar ring, the best supporting character, Hector, makes his dramatic entrance, and Hank shows a sly smile, but Jesse's heart sank. Hector stared him down with a gaze that completely unnerved him.
What's that mean?
That means yes. Yes is a bell, no is no bell.
Oh, come on, this is I mean, look at this dude, all right? He doesn't even know what planet he's living on.
Senor, are we on the planet Mars? Are we on the planet Earth? Senor, is today Friday? Is today Monday? Is today Tuesday?
Next up is Hector's show-stopping performance. It turns out that Hector's mind is very clear. Facing Hector before him, Jesse's heart is filled with despair. However, when Steven asked Jesse if he had been to his house, Hector did not ring the bell at all. At that moment, Jesse's heart was in his throat. No matter how Hank and Steven tried to persuade him, Hector refused to accuse Jesse, because Hector, once a major drug lord, had a principle of not cooperating with the police, and to express his attitude towards the DEA. The paralyzed man chose his own way. As a result, Jesse was released without charges. Meanwhile, due to Walter's strange behavior over the past few days, the doctor responsibly investigated the cause. Dr. Del Cavalli stated that Walter's cancer cells had not metastasized or spread, and his other indicators were also normal. Walter's behavior of streaking in the supermarket and experiencing amnesia puzzled him. To avoid suspicion, Walter quickly explained that it might be due to taking a large amount of Medica-Hectorn. For now, that was the only explain-a-Hectorn. However, just as Walter proposed to be discharged, the doctor firmly disagreed, because he had to undergo a strict psychiatric evaluation before his discharge to prevent similar incidents from happening again. Walter could be discharged after passing the assessment. This was something Walter hadn't anticipated. During his therapy with psychologist Chavez, Walter, who was actually fine, was distracted and stared at the painting on the wall. The painting of a man walking away from home also meant that Walter was gradually distancing himself from his family. Listening to Chavez asking boring case Hectorns, Walter became a bit impatient. When Chavez meant Hectorn that the treatment could take weeks or even longer, Walter bluntly admitted that he hadn't lost his memory and just suddenly wanted to go out for a walk. but he did not reveal what exactly happened during those 3 days. He dared to say this because he had previously understood the confidentiality agreement between doctor and patient. Hearing about Walter's tragic life experience, Chavez expressed understanding. After determining that it was all just a farce, Walter gained the right to be discharged the next day. That night, Walter received a call from Jesse, and the two updated each other on their respective situations. Jesse complained that his money had been confiscated, but at least he had gained his freedom. Walter, concerned, asked if the RV could be fixed. Jesse thought Walter was crazy. After going through this ordeal, Walter still wasn't ready to give up, but Walter didn't care about that. He only knew that he hadn't yet achieved his goal of $737,000. That night, as Walter lay in the hospital bed calculating how much money he still needed to earn, he suddenly remembered that the existing money was still hidden in his daughter's diaper box. To avoid being discovered by his family, Walter sneaked into his own house in the middle of the night. Seeing his own room but not being able to return, Walter's heart was filled with mixed feelings. Fortunately, the money and the gun were not discovered by his family, or else he wouldn't know how to explain it again. Under time pressure, Walter quickly stuck the money firmly in the ventilation duct and then restored the exterior to its original state, not even daring to cough. Just then, the lights in the hallway suddenly turned on, and Walter hurriedly got up and hid behind the door. His wife was also restless at night due to his own issues. Just as Walter was about to leave, he saw his son walking out. He never expected to watch his family in this manner in his own home. At this moment, Walter, peering through the crack in the door, looked heartbreakingly sad. After leaving the house, Walter saw his own missing person flyer at the bus stop and felt extremely guilty towards his family. On the bus ride back to the hospital, Walter, sitting alone, appeared very lonely. Reflecting his psychological state at that moment, he sneaked back into the hospital and, seeing the four hadn't finished dripping, he injected himself, and although it was painful, it was nothing compared to his brutal experiences. At this moment, the painting on the wall appeared again, as if it had always been hinting at Walter's fate. The next day, his colleagues celebrated Hank's commend to Hectorn for killing Tuco and even prepared a special gift for him. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Walter was also preparing to be discharged, and his son was caring enough to advise him to drink more water. Just then, Hank rushed over to celebrate Walter's safe return, marking his first meeting with Walter since killing Tuco. While celebrating, Hank didn't forget to boast about his achievements. It turned out the gift from his colleagues was Tuco's grill embedded in lucite. Seeing this, the recently calmed Walter was again disturbed inside, as he had witnessed the killing firsthand. There's a detail in the camera work here. When Hank first took out Tuco's grill, the angle was just right to overlap with Walter's teeth on the opposite side, indicating that Walter would become the second Tuco here, returning to the familiar home. Although it had only been a few days, the experiences of those days made Walter feel as if he had just been released from prison. Watching his son, who was about to grow up into an adult, Walter didn't know what he could give him besides money. Walter, thinking everything was safe, promised his wife that such incidents would absolutely not happen again. It seemed like everything was perfectly planned, but there was one detail Walter overlooked: the call from Jesse before he disappeared. He hadn't expected his wife to investigate the incoming call. His wife sternly asked him if he had another phone. Walter firmly denied it, unable to explain, and pretended not to remember anything that happened that day. But Skylar wasn't so easy to deceive. She decided to initiate the Cold War mode that is unique to women, but this tactic only works on family-oriented men, and Walter was exactly that type of man. What will happen next? Before dawn, Walter met Jesse at the supermarket and told him that their production of contraband needed to be postponed because he had to mend his relationship with his wife first. Walter gave Jesse $600 for living expenses and asked him not to contact him for the time being, but Jesse said that since his money was confiscated by the DEA, Walter needed to take half the responsibility, because it was he who insisted on dealing with Tuco. However, Walter didn't see it that way. Just as the two were about to start arguing, a police officer walked in, forcing them to temporarily calm down, and Walter took this opportunity to slip away. When day broke, Skylar woke up to find Walter gone again, but hearing him in the kitchen, she breathed a sigh of relief. Despite being in a cold war with Walter, Skylar was still worried about him disappearing again. To please his wife and son, Walter, who never cooks, took the initiative to make breakfast. Walter Jr. was also very surprised to see this. Seeing the lavish breakfast spread, Skylar immediately felt Walter's guilt. as she knew him well after living together for half a lifetime. After breakfast, Walter even took the initiative to clean up the dishes. He first glanced uncertainly at his wife and then took the opportunity to explain about the phone last night. As he explained while cleaning up, Walter kept his back to Skylar and dared not look her in the eyes. There's a detail in the hand-waving AC hectorn here, which is a psychological sign of unnatural behavior when lying. The highly emo-hectornally intelligent Skylar also saw through Walter's lies. Before Walter could finish his explain hectorn, he heard the sound of the door closing. Turning his head, he saw that his wife had already left. He went outside to see Skylar driving away. Walter hurriedly tried to call to continue explaining, but then realized the phone was beside him. Poor Walter was very frustrated, not knowing what he had said wrong this time. When Skylar came back, she was indifferent to him. No matter what Walter asked, she gave non-committal answers, leaving Walter at a loss. Walter's mood sank to its lowest point. Jesse was in a similar state because, during the days Jesse was taken by Tuco, Hank, in his search for Walter, followed the clues to Jesse's mother. When his mother found out Hank was a DEA agent, she immediately became alert and took the opportunity to go to Jesse's house. In the basement, she discovered Jesse's tools and used this as a reason to bring in a lawyer to evict Jesse. No matter how Jesse pleaded, it was futile. Seeing that her son would not voluntarily leave, the mother even went straight to the door to urge. Seeing the situation was dire, Jesse had to lie to deceive his mother. Compared to Walter's lying eyes and movements, Jesse seemed much more sincere. But what's the point? Because his mother doesn't give Jesse a chance to change. Seeing that his mother had already called the moving company to start moving things out, Jesse suddenly became anxious.
I thought this was just a wake-up call.
We are putting it in storage. When you decide to grow up, you can have it back.
No, why don't you grow up, Mom? Jenny wanted me here. I was the one who took care of her. I took her to her appointments and made her lunch every day. I earned this.
You did not make her lunch every day.
What'd you do? Huh? She's lying there, dying.
Start with me.
Now what? You decided to, I don't know, make your eldest son homeless?
Wow! Great family, Mom!
His mother reminded Jesse to hand over all the keys when he left and feigned hope that Jesse would reform. But was her actual behavior really about wanting her son to improve? Walter, on the other hand, continued to work hard at making breakfast, just when his son's best friend came to take him to school with him. But what puzzled Walter was that his son had changed his name to Flynn. He stormed off to confront his wife about it. Skylar explained that Walter Jr. liked being called that by others and that it had been the case for quite some time. It seems Walter has been too neglectful of his son. However, just as he called Skylar to breakfast, Skylar said she was about to leave and politely thanked Walter for making breakfast. Just then the phone rang, and Walter immediately became infuriated when he heard it was Jesse calling. Seeing Skylar was about to leave, he quickly made an excuse to hang up the phone, trying to resolve the conflict between them. Before Walter could speak, the phone rang again. Skylar told him to answer it quickly and then turned to leave. Walter, full of pent-up anger, answered the phone furiously.
Just gave you $600.
Yeah, and thanks, Daddy Warbucks, but that was before my housing situation went completely testicular on me, okay?
You smoked the entire 600, didn't you?
What? No?
Yes.
No?
Look, Jesse, your problems are just that. Your problems.
Mr. White, you're not listening, or I to kick me out of my house!
In his anger, Walter dumped all the prepared breakfast, with no other hectorns. Jesse had to pick up the phone again. It must be said that both of their emo hectorns had hit rock bottom. After packing up all his belongings, Jesse went to seek help from his former friend Paul, using the excuse that his house was being fumigated and he needed to stay at his place for 2 nights. Paul was very welcoming, and they were very happy talking about old times. Just then, Paul's wife, Sarah, came back. Although Sarah had never met Jesse, she had heard enough about him from Paul to know what kind of person Jesse was. Sarah made an excuse for Paul to help her organize things in the room, but in reality, she wanted Paul to find an excuse to disagree with Jesse's stay. Seeing the hectorn, Jesse knew his stay was out of the case hectorn. Sarah also took the opportunity to take her child away, fearing Jesse might have a bad influence on her son. Sure enough, when Paul came out, he said he had forgotten that relatives were coming to stay for a few days. Jesse said he had many other friends and then left very perceptively, but after Jesse made a round of calls, he couldn't find anyone who could take him in. Desperate, he vented his frustration on the phone booth. However, the next second, karma struck, His only motorcycle was stolen. After a day's effort, Jesse finally found his RV. Right now, it was the only place he could stay. However, since he hadn't paid off the final fee, the RV was still locked in Clovis's yard. With no other choice, Jesse had to climb over the wall to get in. Jesse managed to climb up, only to come down much faster than expected. Now you can imagine the scene inside. After a fierce struggle, Jesse finally crawled out, and then he struggled to stand up. Seeing Jesse in this state, he truly looked miserable. Entering the RV, to avoid smelling his own stench, Jesse had to put on a gas mask to sleep. At that moment, he finally couldn't hold back his tears and began to cry. The next morning, Skylar still left without saying a word, leaving Walter alone on the sofa, brooding. Just then, Walter Jr. came over, but today Walter hadn't prepared breakfast like the previous 2 days. To please his son and also to relax his own mood, Walter decided to take his son out to the countryside to experience the joy of driving, but because of Walter's strong need for control, he became anxious when he saw Walter Jr. using both feet to drive. He told his son the correct way to drive, but his son said he found it simpler this way. After some attempts, Walter Jr. ends up knocking the barricade out of the way. The father-son interact Hectorn ended abruptly like this. On the other hand, Jesse, who was sleeping in the RV, was found by Clovis, who told Jesse to pay for the car repairs and the damaged toilets, and then get lost. Seeing Jesse's pitiful state, Clovis knew Jesse definitely didn't have the money, so he decided to sell the stuff inside Jesse's RV. Hearing this, Jesse immediately became anxious. Those things were his and Walter's ticket to turning their lives around. No matter how Jesse pleaded, it was useless. Clovis ruthlessly kicked him out. However, just as Clovis was going back to contact the junk collector, Jesse secretly climbed over the wall. After learning that the barrel of methylamine in the RV was worth a lot, Clovis couldn't help laughing. At this moment, Jesse had already started the RV. He wanted to let Clovis experience what it feels like to push someone too far. Meanwhile, Walter took the opportunity after his son went to school to have a serious talk with his wife. Seeing Walter's sincere apology, Skylar decided to give him a chance. However, Walter's apology did not resolve the doubts in Skylar's heart. Seeing that Skylar didn't want to stop, Walter lost his patience. But before he could vent his emo hectorns, Skylar, who had been holding back his feelings for a long time, was the first to lose his temper.
And you just
Okay, so talk, Walt! Shut up and say something that isn't complete bullshit. You want to know what you have to do. You have to tell me what's really going on right now. Today. No more excuses. No more apologies. No more of these obvious, desperate breakfasts. You don't want to lose contact with me, Walt? Good. Then tell me. Now.
Clearly, Walter was thrown off by Skylar's state.
Tell you what.
Seeing Walter still stubbornly denying everything, Skylar angrily stormed out. Walter had no choice but to follow her out again to try to retain Skylar. Just then, Walter saw the familiar RV parked by the roadside. Now, with his anger bottled up, Walter found the perfect outlet. He launched into a tirade at Jesse. Hearing that Jesse was there to ask him for money was like pouring fuel on the fire. The angry Walter hurled the ugliest words he could think of, giving Jesse no chance to rebut. But Walter didn't know about Jesse's tragic experiences over the past few days, which pushed the already on the edge Jesse to explode. The two men, both at their lowest emohectornal points, fought it out in the RV, but the older Walter was no match for Jesse. Jesse firmly gripped Walter's neck, then clenched his teeth and raised his fist, but ultimately, Jesse couldn't bring himself to strike. After this cathartic fight, both felt much better. Walter took Jesse back to his house and decided to give him half of his own money. As viewers, what we see on the surface is Walter's sacrifice for his family and Skylar's misunderstanding of Walter, but from Skylar's perspective, faced with her husband's lies, she reacted as any normal woman would. So, would you support Skylar's AC Hectorns? Jane is the epitome of beauty in Breaking Bad, and the first girl Jesse truly falls in love with. It's because of her that many people found the motivation to keep watching, and it's also because of her that the cracks in Walter and Jesse's relationship begin to show. Jane's arrival makes the plot even more dramatic, and it perfectly illustrates the selfishness of human nature. Last episode, we left off with Jesse, who was homeless, Receiving his share of money from Walter, he first fulfills his promise to pay off the repair costs for the RV, and he also buys a beat-up little car. Then, he finds a house to rent from an ad in the newspaper, and the landlord turns out to be Jane, the most beautiful character in the series. Jesse is not only satisfied with the house but is even more pleased with the beautiful landlord. Learning that Jane lives next door, Jesse is overjoyed, but just as he's about to sign the lease, he realizes that there isn't much money left. The pragmatic Jane immediately wants to take back the contract, but in front of the beautiful woman, Jesse's emotional intelligence skyrockets. He starts by sharing his tragic life story, then assures her that he has been working hard and will definitely be able to cover the full rent. After much pleading, Jesse finally wins Jane's sympathy and also leaves a good first impression on her. In the end, Jesse successfully signs the rental agreement, but Jane lays down the law with Jesse, warning him that if he messes up in the house, she'll kick him out without hesitation. Jesse readily accepts Jane's terms. Meanwhile, Walter, who hasn't reconciled with his wife, goes to the hospital alone for a checkup. Dr. Del Cavali tells him that the first round of treatment is over and they need to observe for 2 months before proceeding with the next step. This coincides with Skylar's due date. Dr. Del Cavali wonders why Skylar didn't come along this time and asks about their relationship. Walter makes the excuse that his wife has been very busy and that they are getting along well. Although Walter can deceive others, he can't fool himself. He gives affirmative answers but subconsciously shakes his head while sitting. When it comes time to receive the bill, the finance department prints out a several-meter-long list of charges, and Walter feels overwhelmed by the amount. Back at home, Skylar is also worried about the bill, so she plans to seek help from the Elliots. Walter lies to Skylar, saying he will handle it. At night, after his wife falls asleep, Walter quietly takes out his hidden funds, but no matter how he calculates, it's still not enough. The side effects of chemotherapy cause Walter to vomit again, and while flushing the toilet, he discovers it's clogged. After some effort, he finds that a discarded cigarette box is the cause. On the other hand, Hank, having killed the major criminal Tuco, is celebrated for his achievement. George thinks highly of Hank's abilities and assigns him to handle both his current duties and those in El Paso. El Paso, located on the US-Mexico border, is one of the cities with the highest crime rates in the world and a gathering place for drug lords. This assignment sounds like a promotion but is fraught with danger, and any slight misstep could be fatal. But in front of his colleagues, Hank still acts very brave, and they all celebrate for him. However, when Hank is alone in the elevator, his legs suddenly weaken and his breathing tightens, clearly showing his fear of this mission. When the elevator doors open, a panicked Hank tries to appear calm and even goes out to celebrate with 2 colleagues. The scene shifts to Hank brewing beer in his garage when Marie suddenly returns. It turns out Marie found out Hank had taken sick leave just to enjoy life, and she speaks with a tone of reproach. Clearly, Marie doesn't understand Hank's feelings at this moment, as she sees him as an invincible man. Hank, suppressing his inner fear, asks Marie to leave. After she leaves, a distracted Hank accidentally applies too much force and crushes a beer bottle. Meanwhile, Walter met Jesse in the outskirts because he could no longer afford to pay the hospital bills. He needed to get their contraband operation up and running, having Jesse sell the product like they did before partnering with Tuco. Although it won't make them rich, it's the only option they have at the moment. Since Jesse is already on the DEA's radar, he's not willing to risk so much for a little money. They complain to each other about the losses caused by their disappearance a few days ago. But after calming down, Walter says there are only 2 paths forward. The first is to find someone like Tuco to continue partnering with. The second is for Walter to handle production and Jesse to take care of sales. But Jesse says he has a better idea. He suggests that they become their own Tuco, establishing their own sales network and then stepping back from the front lines. Walter doesn't like the idea of others joining them and strongly opposes it. However, Jesse suddenly becomes assertive and gives Walter a harsh lesson.
I remember. I sell. That was the division of labor when we started all this. And that's exactly how we should have kept it.
After Jesse's speech, Walter is left speechless. He admits he needs to slowly learn about sales and suggests that his own ambition might be why Jesse runs into trouble. Seeing Walter admit his mistakes, Jesse's attitude becomes even firmer.
Damn straight. Know why? Because we do things my way this time, or I walk.
Walter looks at him in surprise, and Jesse even calls him by his first name.
You need me more than I need you, Walt.
You know, until now, Jesse has always respectfully called Walter Mr. White.
It's a bold plan, Mr. White.
The scene shifts to Jesse inviting his friends to his newly rented house. Remember, Jesse used to invite his friends over to his house to sample top-notch contraband. However, today, out of respect for his beautiful landlord Jane, he only brought out snacks and drinks. Jesse explains his plan in detail, offering them a $500 commission per ounce because his product is unmatched in the market, and sales volume won't be an issue. The others see this as a great opportunity to make money and comply with Jesse's requests. At the same time, Skylar and Walter, still in a Cold War, go to Skylar's sister's house for a dinner party. The last one out of the car, Walter checks the car's cigarette lighter, because after seeing the cigarette box in the toilet the night before, he suspects his wife is smoking. Their visit to Marie's house is also to celebrate Hank, who is about to be promoted and assigned to execute a mission on the Mexican border. Marie knows it's full of dangers there, but she isn't worried about Hank's safety. Instead, she dreams of living in the villa she has always wanted if Hank works hard for a few years. This is the wife Hank earnestly pursued. She is selfish, self-centered, and extremely vain, making her the most disliked character in the show. Breaking Bad is fascinating because it allows everyone to see a reflection of their own life in it. Skylar is also speechless about her sister. She doesn't want to listen to Marie's vain chatter, so she goes back to the room alone. Unexpectedly, Marie continues to follow her sister, still fantasizing about her dream. Skylar tells Marie to shut up and then takes the opportunity to demand an apology from Marie for her thefts, stating it's Marie's last chance. If Marie doesn't apologize sincerely, she will no longer consider her a sister. Seeing her sister's serious face, Marie finally gathers the courage to apologize to her.
I'm sorry.
As night fell, Jesse's friends frantically sold their contraband, earning substantial returns while also taking on the corresponding risks. Sure enough, Skinny is quickly tricked by someone else. The laughter is truly chilling. A wise man does not eat the loss in front of him. In the end, Skinny obediently hands over all the goods. The next day, when Jesse and Walter are dividing the money, the meticulous Walter notices that $1,000 is missing. Jesse admits that Skinny was robbed by the Spudge couple, but luckily Skinny was unharmed. Seeing Jesse's nonchalant demeanor, Walter immediately becomes agitated. He worries that if word gets out, the same thing will continue to happen, as all the addicts will know about Jesse's weakness. Walter's concern is not unfounded, but Jesse doesn't see it that way. He thinks this is a normal business loss and is satisfied with earning over $10,000 in just a few days. Walter compared Tuco's reputation with Jesse's, and an angry Jesse threw $1,000 at Walter. Clearly not understanding Walter's true intention, Walter wanted Jesse to confront the Spudge couple and establish his authority, so their business could continue to develop sustainably. Walter returns home in the evening, furious at the thought of his wife smoking during pregnancy, and now he finds fault with everything Skylar does. Finally, he can't hold back and confronts Skylar with the cigarette pack from the toilet. Skylar doesn't explain why she started smoking, and they end up having another big fight. Walter, who intended to ease the tension, only makes the marital strain worse. Clearly, he hasn't realized that his own actions have stressed his wife enough to make her try smoking to relieve her boredom. A frustrated Walter goes to Jesse's house in the middle of the night. He wants to teach Jesse how to handle the situation with the Spudge couple's robbery.
You asked me what I want you to do. I want you to handle it.
It's not until then that Jesse understands Walter's true intent. Meanwhile, a sleeping Hank suddenly hears gunshots at home and quickly grabs his gun, entering combat mode. He thinks someone is coming for revenge for Tuco, but after searching, he finds no one. He goes to the garage and discovers that the sound was from his home-brewed beer, where the pressure was too high and popped the bottle caps. Ever since killing Tuco, Hank has been like a startled bird, constantly worried about someone seeking revenge. The next day, he takes Tuco's grill to the riverbank, deciding to throw it away in an attempt to rid himself of the psychological shadow that Tuco's death has cast over him. This little boy who hasn't bathed in 8 years is truly pitiful. He's not only hungry 366 days a year, but he also doesn't have a single childhood playmate. His home environment is a complete mess, with paths so cluttered they could trip someone. The only joy for the little boy is a television picked up from a garbage dump, but this ancient TV doesn't have any children's channels, only featuring a channel that sells dagger advertisements. What's even more pitiful is that the little boy hardly knows how to interact with others, remaining silent no matter how Jesse, who came to collect debts, questions him. Luckily, Jesse is very patient with the little boy, and after several attempts to engage him, the boy finally starts to speak.
I'm hungry.
Initially, Jesse came to collect a debt, but he ended up playing the role of a temporary babysitter to cheer up the little boy. Jesse even tried playing peekaboo, but this tactic was not effective. Just then, Jesse suddenly hears the boy's parents coming home. To prevent the little boy from witnessing a violent scene, Jesse quickly carries him back to his room to hide, while he waits with a gun for the arrival of the Spudge couple. Soon, the Spudge couple enters the room, cursing and swearing. Jesse takes the opportunity to overpower them and demands they hand over the goods they robbed from him, but after searching them thoroughly, he only finds a tiny amount in their underwear. Jesse demands they compensate him for his losses, but the Spudge couple doesn't have any money. They are completely unable to pay him back. At this moment, the little boy walks out of the room, becoming a human shield for the Spudge couple. Jesse hides his gun behind his back, fearing to negatively impact the little boy, and he quietly threatens the couple that if they don't repay the money, he will cut off their supply. Because Jesse is also an addict, he knows exactly how to exploit their weaknesses. Sure enough, Spudge quickly confesses that the money is in the backyard, and Jesse drags him up. As he leaves, Jesse doesn't forget to tell the little boy that he is just playing a game with his dad. However, Jesse soon discovers that what Spudge referred to as a stolen ATM machine, and Spudge even lies to Jesse, claiming it was a victimless crime. Yet, at the scene, the only witness has already fallen into a pool of blood. It can be said that these morally corrupt individuals, desperate for their next high, act without principles or a bottom line. Thinking back, if Skinny had resisted, he probably would have met a gruesome end. Seeing Spudge struggle for a long time without being able to break open the ATM, Jesse immediately becomes impatient. Didn't you say you've stolen 6 of these? How can you possibly not know how to open it? Spudge's wife admits they have indeed stolen 6 but have never managed to open any, implying that it's Spudge's fault for being too dumb. They can fly into a rage over the slightest thing. Jesse tries to separate them and urges Spudge to keep trying to get the money. Just then, Jesse realizes the little boy is missing. He anxiously asks the woman on the couch, but she shows no concern. Finally, Jesse finds the little boy on the bed. Seeing the boy's pitiful state, Jesse sees a reflection of himself. As his own parents were also unkind to him, he storms out to berate the incompetent mother, telling her how to take care of the child. But this becomes leverage for the Spudge couple.
Give me one hit and I'll be any kind of mother that you want.
Yeah, Diesel, this whole thing would go easier if we all had a little taste, man.
Seeing these two unfit parents, Jesse gives up on them and decides to take matters into his own hands. Thus, Jesse spends 2 hours trying to break open the ATM machine without success. It seems there was a reason they couldn't open the previous ATMs they stole. There's nothing Jesse can do about it. At this moment, the little boy came out of the house, probably too bored. The little boy wanted to play hide and seek with Jesse. Jesse patiently plays along with the little boy. At that moment, the woman behind him quietly stood up and knocked Jesse out when he wasn't looking. She didn't think about the little boy's feelings. Fortunately, the Spudge couple doesn't intend to kill Jesse. A few hours later, Jesse gradually wakes up. Since they have taken his gun, Jesse doesn't dare to make any rash moves for the time being. Jesse watched the Spudges prop up the ATM with a chair and prepared to strike from the bottom when the Spudges got into another altercation over their spiritual food. Spudge keeps cursing at the woman, which unexpectedly enrages her.
No skank.
No, no.
The woman, seemingly unaware of Jesse, who has been startled awake, is only focused on taking what she wants from Spudge's pocket. Jesse quickly takes the gun and wipes his fingerprints off the ATM, preparing to run, but just then, the ATM suddenly opens on its own. At this moment, Jesse is panicked and frightened. He dials the emergency number and then prepares to leave. But then he remembers the poor little boy and turns back to him. Jesse first coaxes the little boy to close his eyes, then quickly carries him out and tells him to sit there and not look inside the house at all. He worries that this could cause a huge psychological shadow on the little boy. Before leaving, Jesse doesn't forget to offer his blessings.
You have a good rest of your life, kid.
Seeing this, it's less like a classic American drama and more like an anti-drug public service announcement. Jesse also receives a nomination for Best Supporting Actor at the Emmy Awards for his outstanding performance in this episode. On the other hand, Skylar hears a voicemail from Gretchen because she believes that it has been the Gretchen couple funding Walter's medical bills. She specifically calls to express her gratitude and invites her to come over to her house. Meanwhile, Walter returns to teaching in the classroom, discussing the omnipresent element carbon and mentioning Dr. Hall, the inventor of synthetic diamonds. Dr. Hall worked for General Electric and created untold wealth for the company with his research. However, his salary was only $10, and Walter appears indignant about this. This hints at Walter's dissatisfaction with his own situation. He can only create his own wealth by utilizing his knowledge of chemistry. After class, Carmen shows her concern for Walter's return to teaching and tells him that he can come to her with any needs, promising complete confidentiality. This leaves Walter flattered and leads to a misunderstanding, also laying the groundwork for his later approach to Carmen after being cuckolded. After school, when Walter sees a poster mocking him on his car, he feels greatly insulted. He tells his son that if he catches them, he will tie them up and bury them alive in the desert. This statement is chilling to hear, showing that Walter has become vengeful at this point. Just as Walter Jr. gets home, he sees a luxury car parked outside their house, knowing that only a few can afford such a vehicle, and he wonders whose car it is. Walter realizes the car belongs to the Grey Matter Gretchen couple when he sees the license plate. Walter is somewhat surprised by Gretchen's visit but still forces a smile to greet her. Hearing his wife and son express immense gratitude for Gretchen's financial support, Walter feels uncomfortable but is still worried that Gretchen will expose his lie. However, Gretchen is not naive, and given her understanding of Walter, she has long guessed that this is one of Walter's lies. Though she doesn't know why Walter would lie this way, she still decides to keep his secret for the time being. Gretchen makes an excuse that she has to go back early, and Walter takes the opportunity to follow her. To keep his lie from being exposed, he decides to invite Gretchen to talk privately. They go to a restaurant where Walter keeps apologizing to Gretchen, stating that this matter has nothing to do with her and that he will explain everything to his wife. But Gretchen feels wronged and wants a reasonable explanation from Walter. However, Walter insists he owes her nothing. In fact, he says it was Gretchen who betrayed him in the past. This causes Walter to bring up old grievances, unable to accept financial support from the Gretchen couple because he has never forgiven them in his heart. This leads to a heated argument between them. Gretchen expresses her disappointment in Walter. Walter unleashes the resentment he has accumulated over decades. A meeting intended to clear up misunderstandings ends in discord. When Walter returns home in the evening, Skylar says that Gretchen called to say they would stop funding Walter without giving a specific reason, which Skylar finds very puzzling. Walter quickly says that he met with the Gretchen couple and that their company is having internal problems and is on the verge of bankruptcy. They were too embarrassed to tell her these things, but Skylar is confused because they still drive a luxury car. How could they be bankrupt? Walter claims that these people, due to pride, will continue to put on a facade even if they have no money. Walter explains everything so perfectly that Skylar has no suspicions. Walter successfully resolves the new family crisis. What challenges will Walter face next? And how will Jesse react after witnessing Spudge's gruesome death? Let's look forward to the exciting content of the next episode together. In northern Mexico, near the border, a human head on the ground slowly wriggles, making Hank, who came to provide support, shudder. They quickly drove to the scene, and what they found was even more chilling. A tortoise was crawling forward, carrying the head of a DEA informant. Hank, who had never seen such a horrifying scene, was almost scared out of his wits. He made the excuse of going to the bathroom to ease his tense emotions. Unexpectedly, this was mocked by his colleagues on the border patrol, who said, "Look at you, acting like you've never seen the world before. It's just a tortoise carrying a human head. What's the big deal?" However, the next second proved them wrong. This unexpectedly allowed Hank to escape a disaster. The one who had led the mocking, Vanko, now had his legs destroyed. Ironically, before he acted, he gave Hank a lecture on Chinese history.
Sun Tzu.
Son who?
6th century Chinese general, wrote The Art of War. If you know your enemy is yourself, you'll fight without danger in many battles.
Right on.
Vanko was so confident because they had their own informant inside the contraband cartels, Tortuga. To get accurate information, the DEA agents humbly catered to Tortuga, who deliberately played coy, wanting the DEA to give him more benefits. This was something Hank could not stand by and watch.
How about you stop jerking us off here? Where's the meat? When's it going down?
Don't like, let's make a deal, huh?
Gonna kick your ass, you don't stop wasting his time.
Schrader. My name's Tortuga. You know what that means?
If I'd have to guess, I'd say that's Spanish.
Tortuga means turtle. That's me.
Unexpectedly, the next second, Tortuga's head was placed on a tortoise, and it was even turned into a head bomb. Although no Mexican cartel leader appeared in person in this battle, it still showcased their cruelty and ruthlessness. At the same time, right after finishing his class, Walter secretly contacted Jesse, but Jesse did not answer. With no other choice, Walter drove to Jesse's residence, but after knocking for a long time, there was no response. Unexpectedly, he woke up the beautiful neighbor. Walter lied, claiming he was Jesse's father, and asked the landlord to help him open the door, but Jane firmly refused. Just as Jane was about to send Walter away, Jesse, playing dead, heard their conversation and voluntarily opened the door.
Come on in, Dad.
To avoid Jane's suspicion, Jesse even cooperatively called Walter Dad. The last episode showed that after witnessing Spudge's gruesome death, Jesse was left with a severe psychological shadow. To forget the terrifying scene, he kept numbing himself and complained that Walter had forced him to go. Worried that Walter might forget, Jesse even took out the gun Walter had given him as a reminder, saying that he had handled the situation. Walter, seeing this, quickly explained that he only wanted Jesse to scare them, not expecting Jesse to kill them. Jesse also gave Walter half of the money he had gotten. However, when Walter took out the bullets from the gun, he found that they were all still there. Jesse described the detailed events to Walter, the sound of the ATM crushing the skull crisply echoing in Jesse's ears. Just then, Badger called, saying he had sold all his goods and asked Jesse to send him more. But Jesse told Walter he was not in the mood. He just wanted to forget everything as soon as possible. With no other choice, Walter had to step in himself. He arranged to meet Badger and 2 others at the museum for the deal. From them, Walter learned that the entire town knew Jesse had blown Spudge's head off, and they were very fearful about it. Hearing this, Walter had a light bulb moment and knew his opportunity had come. He turned around, found Jesse, and, with a map of the entire state, started to plan. Walter, seeing gold everywhere and once not wanting anyone else involved, now asked Jesse to develop sub-dealers as soon as possible. Jesse thought he was crazy. Those were other people's territories, and they couldn't touch them. Walter tells Jesse that times have changed, and now he is famous in the circle. Everyone knows it was Jesse who dealt with the Spudges. He says that Jesse is now like a puffed-up pufferfish and the others are just small fish. They wouldn't dare provoke Jesse. After Walter's brainwashing, Jesse instantly revives. Jesse finally agrees to step out of his secluded cabin, and seeing Jane painting, Jesse, who also has a love for painting, takes the initiative to strike up a conversation. Just then, a man riding a motorcycle passes by the door and admires Jesse, which earns him some face in front of Jane. An excited Jesse quickly gathers Badger and the others to start planning the next tasks, and everyone is full of confidence. Later, Jesse reports to Walter about the work, and Walter decides to monopolize the market and raise the prices. And so, Heisenberg began his wild money-making journey, but Skylar obviously doesn't know about Walter's earning ability. Facing the economic pressure at home, she decides to go job hunting while heavily pregnant. Skylar tells the receptionist that she used to work here but resigned due to family reasons and says she wants to see the boss, Ted, but the receptionist says the boss is very busy and asks her to go home and wait for news. Unexpectedly, Skylar directly takes the initiative to seize the opportunity.
Skylar.
It seems Ted has a deep impression of Skylar, which makes the receptionist look bad. They start by chatting about family matters, and Skylar takes the opportunity to state her purpose. Ted is very accommodating and immediately lets her return to her former position. It seems Skylar has a very accurate grasp of Ted's psychology. Back home, she tells her sister about her job search. Marie looks at Skylar in surprise. Skylar is about to give birth, and which foolish company would want her? Skylar says it's the same company as before. This makes Marie even more surprised because Marie knows her sister resigned because Ted had inappropriate feelings for her. And now her sister is putting herself right back in the situation, showing that Skylar is really going all out for her family. The next morning, Walter sees his wife dressed differently and learns from his son that she is going to work, and it's at the company she previously quit. Walter is annoyed that his wife is now not considering the issue of welding fume pollution. She had resigned because of this before. It seems Walter doesn't know the real reason Skylar resigned, but she brushes off this issue with a few words. As soon as she arrives at the company, Ted comes running over to show concern. During their chat, Skylar also learns that Ted has divorced his wife. It's unclear what Ted is hinting at, but as he leaves, he invites Skylar to go out to eat like they used to. It seems there's quite a story between them. Skylar looks at the photo of herself and Walter and feels a twinge of guilt. On the other hand, Jesse, having made a lot of money, buys the most expensive LCD TV on the market. Just as he's figuring out how to use it, he suddenly sees his neighbor Jane coming back, curiously listening to the noise. Jesse hears Jane come into the backyard and follows her, apologizing for hiding his real name from her and that the man who knocked on the door that day wasn't his father. To express his apology, he invites Jane to watch TV with him. Seeing his sincere demeanor, Jane agrees, but embarrassingly, the TV can't find any signal. To relieve the awkward atmosphere, Jesse has to explain the powerful features of the TV. Actually, Jane is also someone who lacks love inside, which we will talk about later. She and Jesse have many things in common, which is the main reason they quickly came together. Just then, Jane takes the initiative to hold Jesse's hand. After the event, Jesse complains that it's time for him to buy some furniture, and Jane suggests he start with a bed. Seizing the moment, Jesse tentatively invites Jane to smoke something with him, but she decisively refuses, because she has been sober under her father's supervision for 18 months. Jesse expresses his great admiration and says he only smokes occasionally himself. Jesse wants to clarify their relationship, but Jane doesn't give a direct answer and just reminds him that his TV has found the signal.
So my boss accused me of stealing!
You are under arrest!
I'd been out partying, minding my own business.
The TV advertisement features the flamboyant lawyer Saul, who will appear in this episode. Because of his excellent performance, a spin-off series titled Better Call Saul was created. His brainwashing slogans left a deep impression on the audience, and his gift of the gab greatly enhanced the watchability of the entire series. To introduce the character of Saul into the story, the director deliberately created an incident where Badger was caught in a sting operation. Notice the slogan Better Call Saul on the back of the long bench. At the same time, Walter receives a call for help from Marie, who says Hank has returned from the border without saying a word and seems like a changed person. She wants Walter to give Hank some guidance. This plot is quite ironic, with a criminal giving psychological advice to a police officer, but in Hank's eyes, Walter is just a pushover who has lived half a life and ended up with lung cancer, with no money to treat it. However, he doesn't know about Walter's experiences since being diagnosed with cancer. Walter uses his own mentality of fighting lung cancer to counsel Hank, saying that the fear inside is his greatest enemy. He encouraged Hank to pick himself up and show those criminals what he's made of. Hank looks at Walter in surprise, thinking he must pull himself together and not let someone he once look down on him. So, Hank pretends to be composed and returns to the DEA to work again. Steven assigned the case of Badger's arrest to Hank because the blue contraband they seized was Heisenberg's work, and Hank had been investigating Heisenberg. The two decide to meet him. At this time, Badger is negotiating with the officer who caught him. As long as he names his supplier, he can be freed. Before Badger can answer, Saul Goodman makes his spectacular entrance, and with his gift of the gab, he instantly leaves Gets speechless. Even on his own turf, Gets can't handle Saul. Saul pitches his services to Badger, handing over his price and business card and assuring him that he is the best criminal defense lawyer money can buy. Just as Saul is about to leave, he happens to see Hank and the others discussing, so he takes the initiative to approach and probe.
Sure, your commercials, they suck ass. But you better act at the courthouse.
Is that like the one your mom works at? Is she still offering the 2-for-1 discount? DEA, huh? For a street bust. Now what would two feds want with that little twerp?
Hank, intending to humiliate Saul, unexpectedly meets his match. Badger gives Jesse Saul's contact information, and Walter and Jesse quickly find Saul's address. Walter feels Saul is unreliable, but persuaded by Jesse, he decides to give it a try. Neither wants to consult Saul in person, so they decide to flip a coin again, but Walter has never won in this regard.
Call it.
Heads.
Walter, fully armed, goes to Saul's office, pretending to be Badger's uncle to negotiate. Hearing Saul mention that this case will be tricky, involving both the police and the DEA, with the DEA's real goal being to identify the mastermind Heisenberg behind everything. Hearing this, Walter instantly becomes unsettled. Saul states that as long as Badger gives up Heisenberg, he can be free. Otherwise, he should just resign himself to his fate. After saying this, Saul prepares to leave.
$10,000.
At this moment, Walter starts coughing nonstop, an action that will later betray him. Do you think Saul was bought off by a mere $10,000? However, now successful in his career, he doesn't care about such a small amount of money, but this money is already a lot for Walter, and the negotiation breaks down because of it. To avoid being exposed, Walter and Jesse make a bold decision. They kidnap Saul as he leaves work and take him to a remote wilderness area. Seeing the large pit in front of him, Saul is terrified, not knowing which client he has offended. Jesse, wearing a hood, directly reminds Saul to provide the best defense for Badger, ensuring Badger doesn't give up anyone else and doesn't involve the DEA. Saul wonders why they don't just kill Badger, but Jesse firmly disagrees. Just then, Walter starts coughing non-stop again, the same action as when he went to negotiate with Saul, leading Saul to recognize him. Realizing he has been exposed, Walter reluctantly takes off his hood. Remember this hood? It's the same one they wore when stealing methylamine, kept for further use, probably planning to continue their crimes once that barrel of methylamine is used up. At this moment, Saul isn't so scared anymore. He slowly stands up and asks them to symbolically pay him $1. Then he can become their attorney and keep all their actions completely confidential. Understanding his client's needs, Saul decided to find someone to impersonate Heisenberg and get arrested. The next day, Saul demonstrated his skills by coordinating with Badger on the script, having Badger report Heisenberg to the DEA and agreeing to cooperate with them to lure Heisenberg out. Back in the office, Saul finds the right person for Walter and Jesse to confirm. The man's name is Jimmy. He's either in prison or on his way there, and he's happy to take the fall for anyone as long as there's money to be made. Saul's price is $80,000, of which $50,000 is his legal fee, and the remaining $30,000 is for Jimmy's compensation, although Jesse thinks Saul's fees are unreasonable. To save Badger and protect their own safety, they have no choice but to accept the terms. The drama directed by Saul is about to unfold. Under the DEA's surveillance, Badger meets the fake Heisenberg at the agreed location for the deal. Because Saul didn't show Badger a photo of Jimmy, Badger mistakenly thinks the old man in front of him is the one Saul arranged. The fake Heisenberg, Jimmy, arrives late. This scene is discovered by Walter and Jesse, hidden nearby. Seeing the plan about to fail, Walter suddenly comes up with an idea. At that moment, Badger signals the old man, but he shows no reaction. Walter tells Jesse to get out of the car to remind Badger, while he drives to block Hank in the other's line of sight. No matter how Hank explains, Walter pretends to be innocent, pretending not to understand. To buy time for Jesse, Jesse quickly goes behind Badger to remind him, and Badger then realizes the situation. Walter kept talking to Hank and refused to leave, and when he saw that Hank was about to flip out, Walter figured that Jesse would have finished the job before he reluctantly left. As soon as the car left, Hank realized that Badger had disappeared from sight and thankfully found Badger in the next chair. It was a false alarm. The two complete the transaction smoothly, and the DEA immediately orders the arrest after obtaining the evidence. When the alarm goes off, Jimmy immediately kneels down, showing that this action has been practiced skillfully. Jesse quickly returns to Walter's car, a perfect ending to a thrilling scapegoat drama. Watching Heisenberg get arrested so easily, Hank felt that something didn't quite sit right. What made this man so angry that he'd beat the stainless steel box out of shape? Because fate always plays such cruel jokes on Walter that he finds it hard to accept this reality. Today, Walter, who was just diagnosed with late-stage lung cancer, had a follow-up at the hospital, and he accidentally found that the film showed a large white area in the lung. Because the specific results would take a week to come out, he felt that his days were numbered. Since Saul had once pitched his services to him, Walter was eager to have him launder the money. However, this time Walter only took out $16,000, and Saul was surprised. He knew Walter's business was very profitable, so why was he laundering so little money? because there had been some issues with the business recently. Walter said he would focus on producing contraband as soon as possible. Saul was of the same mind, since he would get a 17% commission. After a quick calculation by Saul, less than $10,000 was left after the $16,000 was laundered. But Walter had no complaints because it was his only option now. Back at home, Walter suddenly said he wanted to visit his mother. Skylar thought Walter felt his scan results were bad and wanted to see his mother one last time. She urged Walter to be optimistic, but Walter knew that optimism wouldn't change the harsh reality. And to get Skylar to agree to his request smoothly, Walter promised to try to secure some of the estate for her. Seeing Walter so determined, Skylar no longer pressed against his request. Meanwhile, Jesse and Jane, who had just fallen in love, were planning a spontaneous trip. At that moment, Walter suddenly called Jesse and told him that the next few days would be dedicated to producing contraband. Actually, Walter didn't really want to visit his mother, but wanted to make as much money as possible in his last few weeks. But Jesse said he wasn't available today. Seeing Jesse so determined not to work, Walter had to find an excuse he didn't understand.
Our methylamine, it's going bad.
What?
It's losing its chemical potency. Now, unless stealing another barrel sounds good to you...
Hell no.
Right, we have to act fast before... Have a paper and pencil? Come on.
All right.
Lack of culture is really scary. Poor Jane stood up on her first date. The next day, Skylar took Walter to the airport, and as soon as she left, Walter came out from inside. Soon, Jesse drove the RV to the airport to pick up Walter, and then their bizarre journey began. The two drove the RV to the wilderness where Jesse's phone lost signal. He wanted to borrow Walter's phone to call Jane but was ruthlessly rejected by Walter, fearing his wife would investigate his calls again. Seeing Jesse only brought a bucket of water for living, Walter felt it might not be enough. It seems they couldn't bathe for the next few days. Then the two started to put on protective suits to work. Just then, Jesse picked up the car keys that fell on the ground and casually threw them on a nearby workbench. This made the meticulous Walter instantly annoyed. He warned Jesse to put the keys somewhere they wouldn't be lost, because this was the only key to their RV, and losing it in the wilderness could have serious consequences. Jesse, annoyed, put the keys in the ignition, so they wouldn't have to worry about finding them when driving, but he didn't know this was his first fatal mistake. With the gasoline generator started, Walter and Jesse officially began working, and after several training sessions, Jesse had become a competent assistant to Walter to keep the machine running 24 hours a day. The two took turns on duty at night. After several days and nights of hard work, they produced over 40 pounds of contraband. After some rough calculations by Walter, they were each entitled to $67,216.39. Hearing this, Jesse was so happy he almost jumped up. Just then, the RV suddenly lost power. Because they had already completed their task beyond expectations, Jesse wanted to take this opportunity to rest. However, the ambitious Walter wanted to continue. He aimed to use up all the remaining methylamine in the barrel.
There's gotta be a Denny's out there someplace. Grand Slam, hot shower, a bed.
But he was eventually persuaded by the exhausted Jesse. Just as the two were about to leave, the RV suddenly wouldn't start because Jesse had left the keys in the ignition, which drained the starter battery. The two blamed each other, but what was the use? The rational Walter calmed down and decided to find a way to recharge the RV's battery. Since the gasoline generator was out of fuel, Walter had no choice but to siphon some from the RV's fuel tank, accidentally swallowing a mouthful. Jesse, holding the fuel hose, also spilled gasoline on the generator's body. Then the two carried the generator to the front of the RV and connected the positive and negative terminals properly. Now it was Jesse's turn to perform. Because the generator was covered in gasoline, Jesse couldn't start it no matter how hard he pulled. Walter directly provoked Jesse by saying his strength was like that of a woman. To prove he was a real man, Jesse pulled with all his might, only for the generator to suddenly burst into flames. Seeing it about to explode, Walter hurried into the RV to find something to put out the fire, but Jesse reacted faster, grabbing the last bit of drinking water by the door and pouring it directly on the fire. Seeing this, Walter, holding a fire extinguisher, had countless swear words running through his mind. I'm not afraid of godlike opponents, but afraid of pig-like teammates.
Jesse, as always, just... God.
With no other options, Jesse stood on the roof looking for a cell signal but couldn't find any. so he had to come down and ask Walter for the only phone with a bar of signal. Given how dire the situation had become, Walter no longer considered the possibility that his wife might check the phone. Jesse picked up the phone and called Badger for help, telling him their rough location from his vague memory of driving and asking Badger to bring some drinking water and set off immediately. Due to the large temperature difference in the suburbs, the two shivered from the cold at night. Seeing Badger hadn't arrived yet, Jesse asked to use Walter's phone again to check Badger's location. Based on Badger's description of his surroundings, the two men confirmed that he'd gone the wrong way. Before Jesse could correct Badger's route, the only usable phone ran out of battery. By this point, Walter was too weak to blame Jesse, and he just silently turned his head to sleep. The next morning, Walter decided to treat a dead horse as a live horse doctor and began manually generating electricity using the burnt-out gasoline engine. After taking turns for most of the day, Walter, who was suffering from cancer, was the first to be physically defeated. Seeing his condition, Jesse thought he was about to collapse. Then Walter coughed so hard he almost passed out. It was at this moment Jesse realized Walter had deceived him. The methylamine wouldn't spoil. It was Walter's impending death that made him so eager to produce contraband. Walter didn't explain, just lowered his head and continued manually generating electricity. Both were so exhausted, they decided to try starting the RV. Hard work pays off, and Jesse successfully started the RV, but before he could even celebrate for a few seconds, the car automatically shut off again, a huge reversal that almost drove Jesse to despair. At that moment, Jesse suddenly realized Walter was gone. When he comes to the far side, he finds Walter coughing up blood, and it seems that Walter's life has almost come to an end. Walter felt this was retribution for his involvement in producing contraband, but Jesse still tried to console him, saying he did it all for his family. But the dying Walter seemed unable to forgive himself for deceiving his family. At this point, Jesse couldn't care less. He had a new girlfriend waiting for him, so he decided to walk out on foot, but he was stopped by Walter's scientific reasoning because their electrolytes were almost in disarray, and they could very likely faint within an hour of walking out. Hearing this, Jesse became anxious, urging Walter to use his intelligence to think of another way. They couldn't just sit there and wait to die.
Take some of these chemicals and mix up some rocket fuel. That way you can just send up a signal flare. Or you make some kind of robot to get us help, or a homing device, or build a new battery, or wait, no. What if we just take some stuff off of the RV and build it into something completely different? You know, like
Jesse's offhand remark about making a battery instantly sparked an idea in Walter. Walter immediately got up and asked Jesse to collect all the galvanized metal parts. He was going to make the most primitive battery. Next, Walter went back to his chemistry teacher mode, explaining the principles of batteries to Jesse. After their efforts, they made 6 small batteries into a primitive battery pack with all the collected materials. Then Walter connected the positive and negative terminals of the power source, and it was time to witness the miracle. This time it was Walter who started the car. He pressed the accelerator pedal a few times. After 2 attempts, they finally got the RV started. Jesse didn't show the extreme excitement he did the first time. Back at the airport, Jesse promised Walter that even if he died, he would ensure Walter's share of the money was given to his family. At this moment, the two were like saying their final goodbyes, both feeling immensely melancholic. The scene shifts to Walter, waiting with his family for Dr. Del Cavalli's verdict, but to Walter's complete surprise, his symptoms had receded, and the cancerous tissue had reduced by 80%. The Walter family was as thrilled as if they had won the lottery. Dr. Del Cavalli brought out the X-rays of Walter's chest. The whitish patch at his lung was a side effect of his radiation therapy, but this usually isn't severe. It was also the cause of Walter's persistent cough. Dr. Del Cavalli then planned to treat this symptom and reassured Walter's family not to worry. At present, the possibility of recovery still seemed very promising. Though this was fantastic news, Walter felt as if fate was mocking him, leading to the scene at the beginning where he furiously beat the stainless steel box. If he had known his life was not at stake, why would he have taken such risks? Do you think Walter will continue down this path? This is the episode in Breaking Bad where Walter undergoes a major turning point. The once obliging chemistry teacher begins to assert his sovereignty. It was from this episode onwards that Walter, who once reluctantly ventured into danger for his family, now willingly embarked on the irreversible path of becoming Heisenberg. As Walter becomes more corrupted, and due to the disharmony in their marital relationship, Skylar also starts on the path of infidelity, but Walter remains completely oblivious. After Dr. Del Cavali announces Walter's improved condition, Walter feels both joy and sorrow due to the tricks fate has played on him. After a bout of venting, Walter eventually calms down. After his wife goes to work, he can't wait to meet Jesse and tell him the good news about his condition. After hearing this, Jesse is very happy because it means they can continue to collaborate and make more money. But Walter indicates that he plans to stop after selling the latest batch of product. Although Jesse is a bit disappointed, he respects Walter's decision. To celebrate Walter's improved health condition, Skylar specially organizes a family party for him. Everyone at the party is happy, but the protagonist Walter seems to have a lot on his mind. Just as Walter is feeling frustrated by fate's mockery, he overhears Hank bragging to his son next to him, and Hank's talking about the time he went to the border to support a head bomb. Walter Jr. looks up to Hank with admiration. In his eyes, Hank is a true hero, but what he doesn't know is that Hank was completely terrified at the time, and after coming back, he hid at home, too scared to see a psychologist because of his status as a police officer. Thanks to Walter's advice, Hank managed to come out of his fear. Walter hopes his son sees these truths. He should admire his own dad. To change his son's perspective, Walter's next move baffles Hank. He tops up Hank's in his own glasses and then deliberately pours alcohol for his underage son. At first, Hank doesn't notice anything unusual. Walter encourages his son to drink freely, and Walter Jr., drinking hard liquor for the first time, accidentally chokes. Hank comes over to comfort his nephew who doesn't know how to drink, then starts bragging about his heroic deeds again. Walter dislikes his son's admiration for Hank and fills up the 3 glasses again. Seeing Walter pour more alcohol into Walter Jr.'s glass, Hank gets a bit upset.
Whoa, what you doing there? What does it look like I'm doing? Kid's 16. You going for Father of the Year? We're celebrating.
At this point, Walter doesn't care about Hank at all. He is determined to toast with his son. Right after Walter Jr. finishes drinking, Walter goes to fill his son's glass again, but Hank directly blocks the glass with his hand. However, Walter doesn't give Hank any face. He continues pouring the drink over Hank's hand. Seeing Walter being unreasonable, Hank has no choice but to urge his nephew not to drink anymore. Then he turns and takes the bottle away. This directly infuriates Walter.
Sorry, buddy, no can do.
It's my son. My bottle, my house.
It's all right.
What are you waiting for? Bring it back.
Everyone's eyes are on Walter and Hank, and a confused Hank doesn't understand what got into Walter. Just as the two are about to come to blows, Walter Jr., after 3 glasses of alcohol, vomits directly into the swimming pool. Taking this opportunity, Hank quickly comes over to take care of Walter Jr. An awkward situation is thus dissolved. This gave Walter an unprecedented level of satisfaction, but at the same time, it came with a price. Because of this unpleasantness, Skylar started the Cold War mode that women are so good at. After sobering up, Walter called his wife and left a message, admitting his mistakes, but Skylar was not moved. She listened to Walter's message and decided to let him reflect on his actions. Just then, Ted, her boss at the company, came over to greet her, a part of his daily routine at work. Seeing Ted's meticulous care for her, Skylar found herself recalling the feelings of being in love. The next day, Skylar wore a mature and sexy outfit. Ted came over to say hello as usual. In order to catch Ted's eye, Skylar deliberately asked some questions that she already knew, and Ted solved them in a couple of sentences. Just when Ted was about to leave, Skylar purposely showed a very sad expression, and Ted couldn't help but step forward to comfort her, boldly placing his hand on hers. After thinking for a moment, Skylar withdrew her hand, as the gesture was too intimate. Just when the audience thought Skylar was refusing, she wiped her tears and then placed her hand back in Ted's. It looks like Walter's hat is ready to go, but he doesn't realize that his head is turning green, because the home's water heater had been broken for a long time, and since he had nothing else to do these days, he personally went to the store and bought the most expensive water heater. With his strong DIY skills, Walter quickly installed the water heater. The foreshadowing of this water heater incident had been laid since the beginning of the series.
How about buy a new hot water heater? How's that idea? For the billionth time.
Just as Walter Jr. got home from school, he saw the long-awaited water heater and was thrilled. This time, Walter finally won Walter Jr.'s approval. and he took the opportunity to sincerely apologize for letting him drink. Walter Jr. didn't take the matter to heart and bore no blame towards his father. Just when he was about to finish up, he saw the floor had started to mold, so Walter bought new flooring from the market. It seems he was planning to renovate the house. However, Walter's diligent housework did not win Skylar's good attitude. This shows that when there is conflict between husband and wife, it is essential to communicate in time rather than blindly working hard in vain, or the consequences could be very serious. On the other hand, Jesse, who is in love with Jane, gets up early to prepare a breakfast for Jane, knowing that Jesse has always relied on eating odd hours to renew his life. This shows the tremendous change Jesse made for Jane, indicating how much he cares about her. To make up for standing Jane up last time, Jesse decided not to go anywhere today but to stay at home with her. They flipped through some of Jesse's old drawings, which featured characters with superpowers, his idols, but one of them is a retrograde man, who Jesse describes as having the power to run very fast when he is in danger. This also implies that Jesse's character is also like this. He always chooses to run away when he encounters difficulties. Just then, Jane heard someone knocking on her door. She went to see and found it was her father, Donald, coming to check on her. She quickly dressed and went back through the back door. Just as Donald was about to use his key to open the door, Jane opened it, seeing that it was his future father-in-law. Jesse dressed up and prepared to go out to greet him. This time, Jesse's clothes were different from his usual colorful attire, indicating he wanted to make a good impression on his future father-in-law, showing how much he cared about this relationship. However, Jane pretended not to know him, just brushed him off with a few words, and then led her father into the house. This left Jesse feeling very disappointed, and he could only smoke alone in the room to soothe his frustration. After her father left, Jane resumed her role as a girlfriend and came over to Jesse's place, where Jesse questioned why she wouldn't make their relationship public. Clearly, Jane wasn't prepared for this, as her father had always been strict with her and she didn't want to anger him. Jesse felt that Jane was just playing with him, and seeing her indifferent attitude, he chose to escape. This also confirmed the personality of the character in his drawings. The next day, Jesse woke up still unable to get over this issue. Just then, a piece of paper was slipped under the door. Jesse saw that it was a drawing by Jane of a girl apologizing. Seeing Jane taking the initiative to apologize, Jesse was as happy as a child. On the other side, Skylar, wearing less and less, waited for Ted's morning greeting, but this time Ted did not greet her as usual. Skylar had a flash of inspiration and deliberately knocked her pen holder onto the floor, and this trick indeed worked. Skylar's sexy outfit was not worn in vain. Meanwhile, Walter, like a fool, was still fixing the house, and after a busy day, he even went to the supermarket to shop at night. As he was heading to the checkout with 2 cans of paint, he happened to see a shopping cart filled with some very familiar items, the kind of stuff needed to produce contraband. Seeing this young man bring a bunch of useless items, Walter immediately got impatient and decided to give him a lesson.
You're buying the wrong matches.
What?
Those matches. They're the wrong kind. Red phosphorus is found in the striker strips, not the matches themselves. You need to get the big 200-count box of individual matchbooks.
Walter explained a few principles simply, leaving the other party speechless. Walter also reminded him not to buy everything from the same place. Hearing this, the young guy got scared and ran away. Seeing such unprofessional vendors, Walter shook his head in resignation. Because Walter had told Jesse he planned to quit producing contraband, he now felt that the contraband world should not be messed up by these amateurs, so he decided to assert his dominance here. Seeing 2 guys chattering there, Walter walked straight over, his presence instantly dominating. Facing the burly man across from him, Walter showed no fear.
Stay out of my territory.
With just one sentence, he drove the 2 men away. Because of his unique talent in this area, Walter was not willing to just walk away. He felt that only here could he truly demonstrate his value. This man is about to die, all because he was doing business on someone else's turf. After the local gang leader confirmed that Combo was the target, he didn't say a word. Seeing that they weren't sincere about buying the contraband, Combo flashed the gun at his waist. The thugs, sensing trouble, wisely decided to leave. Combo kept cursing under his breath. However, what he didn't expect was for the 2 men to circle back and stop at the corner, staring him down menacingly. Seeing the situation turn sour, Combo immediately made a call for backup. Just then a kid on a bike kept circling him.
Hey, what's that thing in your ear?
What did I say? Get out of here. What are you waiting for? Go.
After Combo shooed the kid away, The car across the street honked its horn a few times. Then Combo heard the sound of a bullet being loaded behind him. It turned out that the kid was the hitman they had sent, with several gunshots. Combo fell to the ground. This is what happens when you encroach on someone else's territory. Then the kid took off with the bike. Meanwhile, under Skylar's escort, Walter went to the hospital for a checkup. Del Cavalli suggested that Walter undergo a procedure to remove lung fluid, but the surgery would cost up to $200,000. He asked them to think it over before deciding. However, Walter unilaterally agreed without hesitation, which confused Skylar. Where would they get that much money? Del Cavalli suggested doing the surgery in 2 weeks, but Walter said it conflicted with his daughter's birth, so he postponed it by another 2 weeks. Back at school, Walter took out the cell phone hidden in the ceiling and saw dozens of missed calls from Jesse, so he hurriedly called back. Jesse said our man Combo was killed. However, Walter didn't know who Combo was exactly, which deeply disappointed Jesse, who then hung up the phone. Skinny also came to Jesse, intending to quit because the incident of Spudge getting his head crushed by an ATM had been exposed, and Jesse's persona had collapsed as a result. With no outlets to sell, the two sought help from Saul. Hearing that they had over 30 pounds of product, Saul was stunned. They were sitting on a gold mine. But what's the point? They've lost their way to cash in. Seeing that the two were clueless about business, Saul introduced them to a mysterious merchant who had been in the business for many years and had never failed. His cautious style was somewhat similar to Walter's. With no better ideas, the two decided to give it a try. Back at home, Jesse hadn't yet emerged from the shadow of Combo's death. He was very down and asked his girlfriend Jane to leave. Jane sensed his troubles and guessed that he was an illicit dealer. Jesse confessed to Jane that he needed some contraband to relax. He wanted Jane to leave for a while. Reluctantly, Jane prepared to leave, but as she opened the door, she hesitated. She decided to stay and join Jesse. Ironically, the courage hanging on the wall is the very thing they lacked. The scene shifted. Walter arrived at the chicken restaurant Saul had mentioned to meet the mysterious person, but he waited a long time without anyone coming to meet him. Half an hour later, Jesse staggered in, apparently having taken quite a bit. The two waited a long time but still saw no one. Just then, a waiter came over to greet them. They ignored him, not realizing that this person was the one they were looking for. Jesse, growing impatient, eventually left. Walter was also anxious to join his wife for a prenatal checkup, so he went to the hospital. Based on Skylar's examination, the doctor recommended a cesarean section the following Friday. After the checkup, Skylar said she needed to return to the company because Ted, the boss of the company, is celebrating his birthday. How can Skylar miss such an important occasion? Ted asked Skylar to sing him a birthday song. At first, Skylar was a bit reserved, but after Ted's insistence and the employee's encouragement, she began her seductive performance.
Happy birthday, Mr. President of Beneke Fabricators Incorporated. Happy birthday to you.
Ted was completely captivated by Skylar's heartfelt performance. On the other hand, Walter was still on the phone complaining that the person Saul introduced him to hadn't shown up, but Saul's reply was that the person had been in the restaurant the whole time. Walter asked him to contact the person again, but Saul said that there were too many intermediaries, which made communication inefficient. Frustrated, Walter hung up the phone. Then he went back to the chicken restaurant to try his luck, so he waited from day until night, when most of the customers had already left. At that moment, Walter saw through the glass the waiter who had greeted him during the day, but his demeanor was clearly that of a successful businessman, not a waiter at all. Walter then realized that this man was the one he was looking for, so he quickly got up and approached him to strike up a conversation.
And 5 minutes of your time.
He was the owner of the chicken restaurant, known in the underworld as the Chicken Man. At first, Gus acted as if he knew nothing and suggested that Walter had mistaken him for someone else, but Walter's intuition was correct. He insisted that this man was the mysterious merchant, since Saul had mentioned that this person was very cautious, and this matched his own way of doing things. Walter asked Gus to give him another chance. In the next second, Gus's expression changed.
I don't think we're alike at all, Mr. White.
He pointed out the flaws in Walter's approach and the lack of punctuality of his partner. Even more fatally, Gus saw that Jesse was an addict, which proved that Walter's judgment was not up to the standard for cooperation with him. But Walter promised that the contraband he produced was the purest product currently on the market, which was his only bargaining chip in negotiations with Gus. After asking Walter how much product he had, Gus turned and walked away.
Will I hear from you?
I have your numbers. You can never trust a drug addict.
Gus's presence completely overpowered Walter. On the other side, Jesse was still immersed in the sadness of Combo's death. To help him ease his grief, Jane brought Jesse an experience he had never had before. It seems that Jane is better at this than Jesse. Afterwards, Jesse was so excited he felt like flying. Meanwhile, Walter was proctoring his student exam at school when suddenly he heard the vibration of a cell phone. He reminded the students to turn off all their phones, but he still heard the sound. At that moment, the students discovered that the noise was coming from the ceiling. It turned out Walter's hidden phone was not turned off. Walter hastily explained that it was the sound of the pipes. After the students left, Walter saw that Gus had sent him a text message. He rushed into Gus's restaurant, but he couldn't find Gus anywhere. Just as Walter was about to leave, he was suddenly stopped by one of Gus's men.
1 hour.
What?
1 hour, you in or out?
In, absolutely, but I just need a little more time.
1 hour. If you miss it, don't ever show your face in here again.
There was only one chance. Walter quickly tried to contact Jesse, but no one answered Jesse's phone. It seemed Gus was right. Jesse really was unreliable. Walter couldn't worry about that now and drove straight to Jesse's place. Meanwhile, at work, Skylar suddenly felt a sharp pain in her stomach. It seemed the baby wanted to come into the world sooner than expected. Walter arrived at Jesse's house and knocked for a long time with no response. Just then, Skylar called, but at this critical moment in the deal, Walter chose to ignore it. He went to the backyard and knocked, but still no one responded. Out of options, he had to break in. When he sees Jesse unconscious, Walter pours water on his face.
Where'd you want it? Where is it? Where's the product? Where is it? Where'd you hide the meth? Where is it? Where?
Under the seat.
While searching for the contraband, Skylar kept calling him, but Walter continued as if he hadn't heard. Finally finding it in the place Jesse mentioned, just as Walter was packing up his goods, Skylar texted. It turned out his daughter was about to be born. Walter first instinctively smiled. Then his face fell instantly. After a moment's thought, Walter decided to go through with the deal with Gus first. If you were Walter, what would you do? Walter rushed to the hospital in a hurry, but he still missed the birth of his daughter. However, Skylar wasn't angry about this because, at the critical moment of her labor, her boss Ted had driven her to the hospital in time. To avoid any awkwardness, Ted quickly left on his own. Walter apologized to his wife and asked if there was anything he needed to do. Since Skylar had come directly from work to the hospital without time to go home and get postpartum supplies, she asked Walter to go back home to get some things. This was exactly what Walter wanted because he planned to take the opportunity of the empty house to secretly hide the money he had earned. Meanwhile, Jesse and Jane were still immersed in their sweet slumber when suddenly a phone call from Donald woke Jane up. Because today was the day she was supposed to go to rehab, Jane hurriedly got up to leave but noticed that the door had been smashed in, clearly a sign of an intruder. A groggy Jesse looked up and immediately sensed trouble. He rushed to the kitchen and discovered that his contraband had been stolen. He immediately called Walter's house.
Come on, hurry up.
So you heard, huh? Yes. Good news. Oh, she's just so beautiful.
Junkie imbecile, what the hell are you calling this number for?
I am trying to tell you, man. Last night, somebody broke in my place, Joe. I got robbed.
What?
Yeah, somebody. They got all of our stuff. Okay. They knew exactly where to look.
Hearing what Jesse had to say, Walter hung up the phone in disbelief. At the same time, under her father's supervision, Jane arrived at the rehab center, where she seemed very nervous facing other people's stories. She kept twirling her 18-month sobriety token in her hands. She had stayed clean for so long, but unfortunately, Jane couldn't resist the temptation again, and her father was completely unaware. Afterward, they went to a restaurant where Donald, seeing Jane looking tired, asked if she hadn't rested well. Jane lied, saying she had been helping someone with a very complex tattoo. Donald didn't want Jane working in such an environment, as most of her clients were thugs and riffraff. He feared she might accidentally fall back into addiction. Donald suggested that she find a good job, to which Jane agreed perfunctorily. Then, Jane politely asked about her father's work at the airport control tower. Donald said it was the same as always, with training even on his days off. This hinted that Donald was too busy with work to pay much attention to Jane, because the last time Donald went to see Jane, he saw Jessie next door looking forward to Jane's introduction. Donald asked her if she was in love. Although Donald's intuition was right, Jane denied it outright. Without evidence, Donald couldn't press further. In the evening, the two families gathered together to celebrate the new baby, with Hank bringing fried chicken from Gus's place. Walter suggested buying a high-tech baby fence, but Skylar worried about the cost, especially since Walter had an expensive surgery coming up, and she planned to go back to work the next day. Walter suggested that Skylar spend more time with the child and that he would figure out the money situation. Although he had already earned millions in cash, he couldn't boast about it in front of his family. That night, when the baby was crying, Walter got up to take care of her. With his wife and son asleep, Walter took the opportunity to show off his earnings to his newborn daughter, giving him an unprecedented sense of satisfaction in front of his family. The next day, Jessie came straight to Walter's classroom after listening to the voicemail Walter had left him. He learned that Walter had already cashed in the product and demanded his share, but Walter didn't give Jessie the money right away because he knew that giving Jessie the money would only lead to his quicker demise. Jessie began to blatantly lie, claiming that he no longer touched those things. Walter simply threw him a cup, saying that if Jessie could pass a drug test, he would give him the money.
Well, I guess until then, you'll just have to depend on the kindness of strangers to get high. That and your little junkie girlfriend.
When Walter mentioned Jane, Jessie immediately became hostile. Seeing that he couldn't get the money, Jessie left dejectedly. From then on, the relationship between Walter and Jessie had a rift. Back home, in order to prevent his daughter from spitting up milk will choke Walter, also thoughtful for her rolled up towel under the body cushion. This detail also echoes the manner of Jane's eventual death. Just then, Skylar walked in and said their son had done something unbelievable. It turned out Walter Jr. had created a fundraising website, something Walter, with his immense pride, could not accept. Walter went to Saul and complained about having so much money he couldn't spend and couldn't let his family know about, making everyone think he was on the brink of bankruptcy. Walter told Saul about his son's fundraising website. Quick thinking, Saul suggested that they could hire a top hacker to funnel money into Walter Jr.'s account in small increments. Although this wouldn't show his own efforts, Walter had no better solution at the moment. On the other side, Jessie, having failed to get the money, started to let loose again. After learning that Walter owed Jessie $480,000, a sinister idea flashed through Jane's mind. The next day, Donald waited at the rehab center, but Jane did not show up. Little did he know, Jane and Jessie were still asleep. Upon receiving Donald's call, Jane knew something was terribly wrong, so she hurriedly got up and, in her panic, went straight out of Jessie's room. Unbeknownst to her, her father had already driven over. When Donald saw his daughter coming out of the next door, he was so angry that he broke the door down. And when he saw Jessie still awake and the tools on the table, Donald was so angry that he was going to kick Jessie out of the room. With the truth now revealed, Jane wanted to have a serious talk with her father, but at this moment, Donald was in no mood to listen to her explanations. Jane had maintained her sobriety for 18 months, but in the end, it all fell apart. Donald was extremely disappointed in his daughter. Jane's current state was deeply tied to her family situation. Left with no choice, Donald decided to call the police, but seeing his daughter's sincere pleas,
Okay, I'll go first thing tomorrow.
Not tomorrow, today.
I have to call into work. I have to stop the newspaper. Last time I went to rehab, all my houseplants died because you didn't water them, so please.
he ultimately softened. Little did he know that this decision would lead to lifelong regret, because Jane had her own plans. She wanted to help Jessie get the money back so they could run away together. To force Walter to hand over the money, Jane's tactics were right on the money.
You know what? I take that back. This is blackmail. Because what I know about you, high school teacher turned drug brother-in-law in the DEA, that'd make one hell of a story. National news, I'll bet. Do right by Jessie tonight, or I will burn you to the ground.
Hearing this, Walter almost spat blood. In order not to lose his reputation, Walter finally sent the money to Jessie. Jessie came over and couldn't even look Walter in the eye.
You'll never hear from either of us again.
You're not seeing straight, Jessie. You're making a mistake.
Walter wanted to give the misguided youth one last piece of advice, but Jane coldly shut him out. With the money in hand, Jesse and Jane fantasized about a life of freedom, deciding to start with rehab. However, upon seeing the last bit of their hidden contraband, they decided to indulge one last time before leaving. A depressed Walter went to a bar to drown his sorrows and coincidentally met Jane's equally troubled father. They don't know each other, but they're both in the same boat, and they talk about their kids. Here, Walter spoke only of Jesse, whom he had long considered as his own son. Walter asked Donald for advice on how to discipline children. Donald expressed his belief to never give up on family. It was this very phrase that made Walter turn back to Jesse's house. He didn't want to see Jesse continue to fall into decay, so he decided to have a serious talk with him. But when he knocked, there was no response. Looking through the back door, he saw they were already asleep. Walter still went in, intending to wake Jesse up. While calling out to Jesse, he accidentally turned Jane over, leading to her choking. Walter instinctively went over to save Jane, but he stopped when he got to her side because in his heart, Jane was nothing but trouble, and that's how Walter watched Jane choke to death. This further darkened Walter's character. Jesse woke up to find his girlfriend had turned into a cold, lifeless body. He tried to perform CPR on Jane, but she showed no response. Jesse broke down in inconsolable sobs. At the critical moment, he still called Walter, who pretended to know nothing and comforted the heartbroken Jesse. Little did Jesse know, Jane's death was directly related to Walter. Walter told Jesse to wait there for help, as he had already planned his next move. The scene shifts as a car pulls up in front of Jesse, and the person getting out is Mike, the cleaner sent by Saul on Walter's orders. To prevent Jesse from facing prison, Mike expertly cleaned up all the incriminating evidence at the scene. Before leaving, Mike instructed Jesse on how to deal with police interrogation. Seeing Jesse refusing to accept the harsh reality, Mike slapped him to wake him up.
I woke up, I found her, that's all I know. I woke up, I found her, that's all I know.
Again?
I woke up, I found her, that's all I know.
Then Mike continued to explain what was going to happen next and advised Jesse that if he was taken to the police station for questioning, he should say nothing and immediately contact his lawyer, Saul. This clearly showed that Mike was no ordinary man. Meanwhile, Donald still didn't know that his daughter had died. He had planned to go to rehab with her that day. Donald arrived at her doorstep only to realize something was wrong, and upon seeing his daughter's cold body, he fell silent. After cooperating with the investigation, he didn't lash out at Jesse but chose to leave quietly. At the same time, Walter Jr., who had created the fundraising website, was glued to his computer, watching the account balance rise and feeling an unprecedented sense of achievement. Skylar was also very pleased with her son's success. Little did they know, all this was Walter's orchestration behind the scenes. On the other side, Hank at the DEA also prepared a donation jar for Walter, and to show his appreciation, he brought over some of his homemade beer, because they found blue contraband on the deceased combo. Hank linked this to the Heisenberg case. After Hank's investigation, it was clear that Combo was just a low-level player who couldn't possibly produce something of such high purity. But here's the issue. Ever since Combo's death, the blue contraband had miraculously disappeared from the town. Additionally, the prisoner who previously stood in for Heisenberg had been exposed by Hank, who was certain that Heisenberg was still at large. Hank's dogged determination on the case hinted at an inevitable showdown with Walter in the future. Meanwhile, Walter was very worried about Jesse, so he used the phone hidden in the toilet tank to contact Jesse, but no one answered. Finally, with Saul's help, Walter found Jesse's hiding place. To numb himself, Jesse hid in a chaotic place. Walter couldn't bear to see Jesse continue to fall, so he took him to a high-end rehab center and advised Jesse to adjust as soon as possible. Jesse remembered a phrase Walter had said when they were trapped in the desert.
I deserve whatever happens.
At this point, Jesse was slowly accepting reality. Meanwhile, the DEA chief, George, was introducing their investors to Hank, and surprisingly, Gus was one of them. This proved that Gus had infiltrated deep into enemy territory for his business, showing his meticulous approach to operations. Seeing the donation jar Hank had set up for Walter, Gus learned about Walter's relationship with Hank and that Walter had been diagnosed with cancer. It seemed Gus's trip was not in vain, and he even casually donated some money to Walter. On Walter's side, he had just returned home when he saw TV station personnel. It turned out that Walter Jr.'s fundraising website had gone viral. Marie had even invited the television station for an interview, which made the supremely proud Walter very uncomfortable. Facing the camera, Walter Jr. praised Walter and called his father his idol. Hearing how his son saw him as a good father and thinking about the things he had kept from his family made Walter feel very uncomfortable. The next day, accompanied by his wife and son, Walter prepared to start his surgery. The doctor first administered general anesthesia, and under the effects of the anesthesia, Walter began to get a bit delusory, and it was at this time that Walter unintentionally made a fatal mistake.
Where's your phone? Your cell phone, did you bring it?
Which one?
This very phrase made the astute Skylar feel that something was off, but facing Walter, who was about to undergo surgery, Skylar found it inappropriate to continue questioning. Walter's surgery went very smoothly, and it wasn't long before Dr. Del Cavali allowed him to be discharged, but Skylar was more concerned about whether Walter could now live independently. Walter had no idea that he was about to plunge into a family crisis. Back home, Walter saw his wife inexplicably packing her bags, saying she was taking the kids to her sister's for a couple of days, and she asked Walter to move out of the house during this time, leaving Walter completely baffled. It was not until Skylar mentioned the phrase Walter had said before his surgery.
Right before your surgery, I asked if you had packed your cell phone, and you said, which one?
Walter tried to excuse himself by saying he was in a comatose state at the time, but Skylar had investigated everything clearly, including from the start of Walter's disappearance. Skylar also knew that Walter had not accepted the financial help from the Gretchen couple. She thought the money for Walter's treatment was funded by Walter's mother, so she called her mother-in-law, only to find out she didn't even know her son had cancer. So where had Walter gone in the 4 days after she dropped him off at the airport? Skylar's barrage of questions caught Walter off guard, and he didn't know how to explain to his wife. Seeing Skylar determined to leave, Walter was ready to tell his wife the truth about everything, but Skylar didn't give him the chance.
Will you stay? Stay, and I will tell you everything.
Whatever it is, I'm afraid to know.
Abandoned, Walter sat alone in the backyard, lost in thought, when suddenly he heard a loud bang. It turned out that 2 planes had collided in the air, and the cause of the crash was due to Donald's operational error, but this was also related to Walter, because Jane's death had a direct connection to him. However, at this time, Walter still did not know he was intricately linked to this tragedy.